14 feet under the platforms at Los Angeles Union Station, there is a neighborhood. Not a foundation line, not a scatter of bricks, a neighborhood, with its streets lying in the order the people who lived there walked them, packed under fill dirt that was trucked in to level the ground for the tracks. It was still down there in 1987, when a crew boring a subway station came up out of the dirt holding somebody's teapot. About 3,000 people lived on that ground, east of Alameda Street, in the oldest part of the city. They had a 2-story brick building that every family in the neighborhood treated as their city hall, because it was the one address in the county where their disputes were heard, their letters were written, and their money was held. It was called the Garnier Building. The real city hall belonged to a government that had spent 50 years making sure most of them could never become citizens of it. In 1933, the clearance began. In 1939, the station opened, and 500,000 people came downtown across 3 days to celebrate. In February of 1926, the city put the question of where to put the terminal to the voters, and that question carried by 51.1% to 48.9%. 2 points. About 1 voter in 50. And the people living on the ground in question were, in the main, forbidden by federal law from becoming citizens, which meant they were forbidden from voting on it. Not a conspiracy, not a back room. An election held in daylight, in a city where the people with the most to lose were not permitted on the ballot. There is something else this story does that no other clearance I have looked at does, and it happens inside 1 month of 1938. 2 brand new Chinatowns opened in Los Angeles 18 days apart. One was financed and owned by the people who had been evicted. The other was built by a white developer out of the leftover sets of a Hollywood film. Both were designed to be looked at. None of that lands unless you know what stood on the ground first. And what stood there was 50 years of work by people the city had already tried to kill once. The first federal census taken in Los Angeles, in 1850, lists 2 Chinese residents. Their names are recorded as Alus and Ah Fu, and they worked as house servants for a couple named Robert and Mary Haley. Those 2 were the entire Chinese population of the city, in a town of a few thousand people, in the year California became a state. 20 years later, there were about 200, and more than half of them were living in the adobes along one short, unpaved alley running off the old Spanish Plaza. In Spanish, it was called Calle de los Negros. The name went back to the dark-skinned Californio families who had lived on it before anybody Chinese arrived. Anglo-Los Angeles translated that name into a racial slur and used the English version everywhere, in speech, in the newspapers, and in the official record as ordinary vocabulary. The alley itself was the city's vice district. Saloons, gambling houses, brothels, and a reputation that got printed every time anything happened there. It was about 500 feet long. It was where the Chinese laundries and the Chinese stores went, because it was where rent was cheap and where nobody with any standing wanted to live. Understand what Los Angeles was in 1870, because the scale of the thing gets lost in hindsight. This was not yet a metropolis. It was a cattle town of about 5,000 people, with dirt streets, no sewer system worth the name, and a homicide rate that historians have argued was among the worst in the country. The Chinese who came were mostly men from a handful of districts in Guangdong province, recruited into railroad work and then released from it when the track was finished, looking for whatever was left. What was left was laundry, produce, domestic service, and the vegetable trade. Within a decade, Chinese growers and peddlers supplied a large share of the fresh food in the city, working ground on the edges of town and carrying it in by cart. That is the shape of the community on the 24th of October, 1871. About 200 people on one alley, doing the work nobody else wanted, in a town that had already decided what it thought of them. On the afternoon of the 24th of October, 1871, 2 Chinese companies in Los Angeles were in a dispute over a woman named Yut Ho. The dispute turned into a street confrontation, and a man recorded as Wan Choi was shot in the neck and fatally wounded. A constable came to the shooting and was wounded inside a building on the alley. Robert Thompson, a rancher who had come to help the police, was shot in the chest. He was carried to an apothecary on Main Street and died about 2 hours later. Word of Thompson's death went through the town, and the town came to the alley. Roughly 500 men gathered on a rumor, passed from mouth to mouth, that the Chinese were killing white people wholesale. 500 men in a city of about 5,000, 1 adult in 5. The attack started at about 8:45 that evening. Men climbed onto the roofs of the adobes, cut holes through them with pickaxes, and fired down into the rooms where people were hiding. Others waited at the doors. The people who came out were taken to improvised gallows and hanged, at a wagon, at a gate, at an awning over a shop. At least 18 Chinese people were killed. The count is still argued over, and the most detailed accounts give 19. 15 of them hanged and the rest shot. Whichever figure is right, roughly 1 in 10 of every Chinese person in Los Angeles died that night. One of them was a physician. His name was Qilong Tong, and he was known in the city as Jean Tong. He spoke English, and he treated white patients as well as Chinese ones. He was hanged with the rest. One of the dead was hanged without his trousers, and with a finger cut from his left hand so somebody could take the ring off it. That was one night in the middle of a Tuesday week. Here is what the law did about it. A coroner's inquest produced 49 indictments naming 150 individuals. The trials ran through the early months of 1872. Most of the cases went nowhere. In the one case that produced convictions, for the killing of Jean Tong, the men convicted were convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, and on the 30th of March, 1872, 8 men were sentenced to terms of 2 to 6 years at San Quentin. On the 21st of May, 1873, the California Supreme Court threw the convictions out. The ground was that the indictment they had been tried on was fatally defective because it had failed to allege that Jean Tong had been murdered. The district attorney, Cameron Tom, chose not to retry the case. Every one of the convicted men walked out of San Quentin in the spring of 1873. Nobody served a full sentence for any death on that alley. 6 years after the massacre, in 1877, the city renamed the street. The alley was absorbed into Los Angeles Street, and the name that had been printed in every account of the killings stopped appearing on maps. The neighborhood stayed exactly where it was. It was the paperwork that moved. The reason the killings did not empty out the neighborhood is that there was nowhere for anybody in it to go, and within a decade there was a federal law making sure of it. The Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882. It suspended the immigration of Chinese laborers, and it did something less discussed and more permanent. It barred Chinese immigrants already in the country from ever becoming naturalized citizens. The Garnier Act of 1892 extended it and added a requirement that Chinese residents carry papers proving their right to be in the United States. Across the country, the effect was a population that shrank and aged. 105,465 Chinese people were counted in the United States in 1880. 40 years later, the count had fallen to 61,639, and almost none of that loss was made up, because making it up was the specific thing the statute had been written to prevent. Inside Los Angeles, it produced a demography you can read the law off. Because women were effectively excluded, and because men had come alone expecting to earn and return, Chinatown became a bachelor society. By 1910, only 5.7% of the Chinese population of Los Angeles was female. 10 years after that, Tyrus Wong came over from Guangdong province at the age of 9, was held at Angel Island while the government satisfied itself about him, and then went to live with his father in a single room on Ferguson Alley. His father was the whole of his family in the country. Remember him because he comes back into this story on a cellar wall. The county numbers move in a way that tells its own story. 4,424 Chinese residents in 1890, 3,209 in 1900, 2,602 in 1910, 2,591 in 1920. Then, in 1930, 3,572 as an American-born generation came of age. That American-born generation matters, and it is the one detail people skip. In 1898, the Supreme Court took the case of Wong Kim Ark, the son of a San Francisco cook who had been born in that city, had gone back to China to see family, and had then been refused re-entry to the country he was born in. The court held that a child born in the United States to Chinese parents was a citizen by birth, so the children could vote. The parents never could, not until 1943. Set that against the ballot that arrives in 1926, a neighborhood full of adults with no vote, and a city about to hold an election on whether to build a train station on top of them. The other thing they could not do was own the ground under their houses, and in 1913, that stopped being custom and became law. California passed its Alien Land Law in 1913. On its face, it was aimed at Japanese farmers, and it was written in a phrase that did the work without naming anybody. It barred land ownership by aliens ineligible to citizenship. The Exclusion Act had already made Chinese immigrants ineligible for citizenship. The two laws clicked together like parts of a machine, and neither of them had to mention the Chinese at all. So, Old Chinatown was a neighborhood of tenants. Most of it stood on land that had belonged to a Californio family named Apa Plaza, grazing ground and vineyards on the east side of Alameda Street, run after the old man's death by his widow. Chinese residents leased, subleased, and rented. They built businesses inside buildings they could never buy, on streets they had no standing to petition about. And in 1913, the ground began to move under them. That year, a large part of the neighborhood was tied up in a three-way lawsuit between the Plaza family and the city of Los Angeles over who actually owned the Chinatown streets. On the 12th of December, 1913, the family sold the Old Chinatown property, about 6 acres of it, to the Southern Pacific Railroad for $310,000. 11 months later, on the 7th of November, 1914, the San Francisco capitalist L.F. Hanchett bought about 25 acres east of Alameda Street for over $2 million. Nobody who lived on either parcel was a party to either transaction. The dirt that would bury it was still 19 years away and already had a buyer. Once the leases had run out and everybody with a stake knew redevelopment was coming, the owners stopped spending money. Roofs went unrepaired. Plumbing went unreplaced. The streets inside the neighborhood were not paved until 1929 and 1930, which is to say 60 years after the first families moved in, and 4 years after the city voted to put a railroad terminal on top of them. That neglect is the thing that gets used against the residents 20 years later. When the newspapers of the 1920s described Chinatown as decayed, they were describing something accurate. They were simply describing it as a fact about the people who lived there rather than a decision made by the men who owned it. And the strange thing, the thing the record makes plain and the newspapers never did, is that the community built anyway. Between 1890 and 1910, Old Chinatown reached its full size, and by any measure, it was a real place rather than a district. Roughly 15 streets and alleys, about 200 buildings, over 3,000 people by the turn of the century, on the figure the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California published. And the society was careful to call it an estimate rather than a count, because no census taker ever walked those blocks as a unit. What got counted was the ward. In 1890, the city's own historic context statement puts 1,781 Chinese residents in Los Angeles, of whom 1,261 lived in Ward 8, the ward that held Chinatown. Its main street was called Plaza Street, after the family that had once grazed cattle on it. Ferguson Alley ran 1 block from the plaza to Alameda. The neighborhood ran its own telephone exchange. A telephone exchange is not decoration, it is infrastructure. It meant that a community the city would not wire properly had gone out and wired itself. But the building that carries the argument is the one from the cold open. Philippe Garnier, a French settler and businessman, put up a 2-story brick block in 1890 and leased it to Chinese tenants. From the 1890s to the 1940s, it did the job a city hall does. The Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association sat in it and arbitrated the disputes no county court would hear fairly, so a man with a lease complaint walked upstairs instead of walking to a courthouse that would not believe him. A general store, a mission school, and the Chamber of Commerce took the other rooms. Think about what that building had to be, in a city where the people using it could not vote, could not naturalize, could not own property, and had watched a mob hang 18 of their neighbors without a single completed sentence resulting from it. 1 brick block did all of it, run by the people who needed it because the alternative was nothing. And the thing that started to break it was not the city. It was a business opportunity, taken by Chinese merchants, a mile and a half to the south. On the 13th of April, 1909, articles of incorporation were filed for a wholesale produce market at 9th and San Pedro Streets, on more than 6 acres of ground. It was called the City Market of Los Angeles, and its shareholder register is one of the more remarkable documents in the city's history. 158 Chinese holdings with 40,885 shares, 65 Japanese holdings with 35,150, 19 holdings by white investors. In a state that would pass an alien land law 4 years later, Chinese and Japanese merchants had assembled the controlling interest in the wholesale produce trade of Los Angeles by buying it. The man who drove it was Louis Quan, a produce dealer, fluent in English, and by every account, extremely good at this. Construction on the first 3 buildings started on the 24th of April, 1909, and finished on the 31st of July the same year, 14 weeks. The families whose money came out of produce started living near the market rather than near the plaza. A second Chinese settlement grew up around 9th and San Pedro. A third grew up around East Adams. The wealthiest households and the most mobile businesses drained away from the old neighborhood over about 2 decades, and what stayed behind was the population with the fewest options, in the buildings the landlords had stopped maintaining. By the 1920s, when the city's planners looked at the ground east of Alameda Street, they were looking at a place that had been hollowed out by 20 years of ordinary economics and deliberate neglect, and they described what they saw as blight. It was blight. It was also somebody's ledger, and the ledger belonged to a railroad and a San Francisco investor. The men who would one day have to go out and buy themselves a Chinatown somewhere else were, in those years, still paying rent on this one. Los Angeles had a genuinely serious railroad problem, and it is the reason any of this ever reached a ballot. By 1910, the city had 3 separate railroad passenger stations run by 3 competing companies: the Southern Pacific, the Santa Fe, and the Los Angeles and Salt Lake. Their tracks crossed the streets at grade, hundreds of times, in a city whose population was doubling every decade. People were being killed at the crossings. Freight and passengers competed for the same rails. Nobody could get from one line to another without crossing the city. In 1911, a transportation engineer named Bion J. Arnold produced a study, and in it he recommended putting a single Union Station at the Plaza. That recommendation is the origin of everything that follows, and it was made 22 years before a single building came down. In July of 1915, city agencies filed a formal complaint with the California Railroad Commission against all 3 railroads over the grade crossings and the terminal situation. On the 11th of June 1917, the California Supreme Court held that the commission had jurisdiction over the crossings. The railroads kept fighting. On the alley, the practical result of that ruling was another decade of nobody repairing a roof. The reason they fought is straightforward, and it is worth saying plainly, because it is not the reason people assume. A single consolidated terminal would have folded 3 privately owned stations into one shared facility, subject to public regulation, and it would have handed a city government leverage over 3 companies that had spent 40 years not having any. So the railroads produced an alternative, and it was not a stalling tactic. In 1925, the Kelker and DeLue report set out a rapid transit plan for Los Angeles, built around elevated lines running through downtown, linking the 3 existing terminals to each other and to the Pacific Electric interurban network, and lifting the trains off the streets. It would have solved the grade crossings. It would have left every station where it stood, and it would have left the neighborhood east of Alameda Street alone. That is the plan Los Angeles voted down. The 2 propositions went on the ballot in February of 1926. The newspapers took sides and did not pretend otherwise. The Los Angeles Times campaigned for the Union Station. The Hearst paper, the Examiner, campaigned for the railroads and their elevated lines. Turnout was about 60%, which was the largest for a city election in the history of Los Angeles up to that point. And there were no candidates on the ballot at all. People came out for this. Proposition 8 asked whether the city should have a single unified passenger terminal. It carried by about 61% to about 39%. Proposition 9 asked whether that terminal should go at the Plaza. It carried by 51.1% to 48.9%. Stop there. That second number decided everything that comes after it. A margin of 2 1/5 points in an election with no candidates decided where a railroad terminal would sit, and therefore which neighborhood in Los Angeles would cease to exist. Had roughly 1 voter in 50 gone the other way, the terminal would have gone somewhere else, and about 3,000 people would have kept their addresses. Now add the second half of it. The Exclusion Act meant the immigrant generation in that neighborhood could not naturalize. Not being citizens, they could not register. Not being registered, they could not vote in the election that decided the fate of the street they lived on. Their American-born children could, and by 1926, some of them were of age, and some of them did. But the adults who owned the businesses, who paid the leases, who had been there since the 1880s, were legally invisible on the day it was decided. This is what the channel keeps finding in different costumes. Nobody had to hate anybody in the room. The system had simply been built so that the people on the losing side of the question were not in the room. The Los Angeles Times summarized the outcome for its readers in one sentence that belongs next to that margin. The Union Depot plans, it wrote, spell the passing of Chinatown into the dim history of early Los Angeles. Strip the sentence of its softening, and it says something plainer. A neighborhood of 3,000 living people had just been reclassified as history, 7 years before anybody touched a brick. The honest counter-argument deserves its space here, before the machinery starts. Los Angeles needed a Union Station. The grade crossings were killing people. The 3 terminals were a genuine failure of coordination that the railroads had shown no interest in fixing on their own for 4 decades. and which they only stopped fighting when a federal court made them. In 1933, the Long Beach earthquake damaged the Santa Fe's La Grande station badly enough to make the point physically. The building that eventually went up is one of the finest railroad terminals in the country. It has been protected as a Los Angeles Historic Cultural Monument since 1972 and listed on the National Register since 1980, and it is still working. None of that is in dispute here. The Plaza site also had real arguments behind it. It was where the city had begun. It was where the existing tracks already converged. It was cheap because the land had been assembled by two owners who wanted it developed. And here is the point the counter-argument runs into. None of that required this specific ground. The city could have taken the site south of the Plaza. It could have taken the railroad's elevated plan and left every terminal standing. It voted, narrowly, for the one option that required removing a residential neighborhood. And then it spent the next 7 years building the terminal without ever producing a plan for the people living on the site. The railroads did not accept the ballot result, and they kept litigating for another 5 years. The case reached the United States Supreme Court in 1929 in a dispute over whether the Interstate Commerce Commission or the state of California had the final say over what got built. Los Angeles won that one. The railroads went back and argued the merits, which bought them 2 more years. On the alley, those 2 years were 2 more years of people signing leases on buildings that had already been sold over their heads. The railroad's resistance ended in Washington. On the 18th of May, 1931, the United States Supreme Court decided the case of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company against the Railroad Commission of California and upheld the order requiring the railroads to build a Union passenger station at Los Angeles. The community's own histories date the approval of the condemnation to the following day. 20 years of litigation ended in one opinion, and in the whole of that 20-year record, across the Commission, the state courts, and the Supreme Court, there is no proceeding in which a resident of the neighborhood was heard. The ground under all of it was about to go up 14 feet. The clearance began in 1933, and it is the part of this story where the record thins out in a way that is itself informative. One account dates the start of it to a Friday morning, the 22nd of December, 1933, near Alameda and Aliso Streets. From 1933 to 1938, block by block, every building east of Alameda Street came down, and Mexican families living on the neighborhood's northern edge were removed along with the Chinese ones. How much notice people got is genuinely disputed. Wikipedia's account, drawing on the community histories, says the railroad gave the community 24 hours to evacuate ahead of demolition. NBC Los Angeles, reporting on the Huntington's exhibition in 2024, says families were given mere weeks. No letter, no notice, and no ordinance from that process has been produced by any source I have been able to read. So set the disputed notice aside and look at what is not disputed, because the absences here are firmer than the details. There was no relocation office. There was no rehousing program. There is no record of compensation being paid to a single tenant. There is no record of a public hearing at which a resident of the neighborhood spoke. The condemnation money went where condemnation money goes, to the owners of the land. And the owners of the land were a railroad company and the estate of a San Francisco investor who had bought it 19 years earlier. Everybody in that neighborhood was a tenant, by operation of a law written in 1913, and tenants are not parties to a taking. A writer named Garding Louis published a book about Chinese life in Los Angeles in 1948, and one sentence in it has outlived the rest. The old men, he wrote, were shaken as if by an earthquake when they learned that a modern Union Depot with expansive grounds was going to dislodge them from their long-established habitations. A former resident, David Lee, put the same thing without the literary register in an oral history recorded decades later. "We as Chinese at that time," he said, "we only living here. We don't own here. If they want you to move, you move." Another former resident, Jenny Lee Taylor, said this: "They felt bad. They all had to move, regardless of what they felt, they still had to move." The Los Angeles Times, covering the same period, told its readers that Chinatown was doomed by the march of the Greater Los Angeles Civic Center. Doomed is a word about weather and fate. What was happening was a schedule. And while it was happening, on a street that had already received its notice, 4 men opened a restaurant. In 1935, with the clearance 2 years underway and the tracks already being graded, Eddie C. opened a basement restaurant beneath his family's antiques business in Old Chinatown. The family firm was called the F. Sui One Company. The restaurant was called the Dragon's Den. He hired 2 young artists to paint the walls. One was Benji Okubo. The other was the boy from the single room on Ferguson Alley, Tyrus Wong, 24 years old by then, who had won a full scholarship to the Otis Art Institute and had been the only Chinese-American student there. The 2 of them painted the 8 immortals and a Chinese dragon across the exposed brick of a cellar in a condemned neighborhood. Wong hung his own paintings in the mezzanine and worked the floor as an unpaid waiter, because it was 1935 and there was no money anywhere. The Dragon's Den became the place in Los Angeles where the art crowd and the film crowd came to eat, in a basement, in a district the newspapers had already written off. For a couple of years it looked like the neighborhood might survive as something. Businesses just outside the required footprint were told they could stay. People renewed leases. The murals went up. They were wrong. And the reason they were wrong is that nobody had told them where the line ran, because nobody had held a meeting to tell them. 3 years later, Tyrus Wong was working at Walt Disney Studios, where he became the inspirational artist behind the look of Bambi. He died in 2016 at the age of 106. The dragon on the cellar wall went under the fill with everything else. To carry a railroad terminal and level the tracks, the site had to be raised. Fill dirt was brought in and spread across the cleared ground, and the remains of the neighborhood, the foundations, the cellars, the privies, the rubbish pits, and everything in them were sealed 14 feet below the new rail bed. The people came up out of the ground and went in 4 directions. Some went south to the city market district around 9th and San Pedro, where the produce money already was. Some went to East Adams. A remnant hung on in Ferguson Alley, a 1-block strip between the new station and the old Plaza, with a handful of businesses and a Buddhist temple. And that remnant survived into the early 1950s before the freeway took it. And a group of men decided that if the city was going to remove a Chinatown, they would build one, and they would own it. The man who ran that effort was not a merchant. Peter Suhu Sr. graduated from the University of Southern California in 1923 and became the first Chinese-American engineer employed by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. He spoke fluent English, he understood how the city's own machinery worked, and people called him the unofficial mayor of Chinatown. On the 22nd of April, 1937, 28 founders met and formed an association, with a merchant named Li Hua Shu as its first president. Most of them were shop and restaurant owners. Then they hit the wall that every Chinese person in California hit, which was that no individual among them could legally buy the land. So they formed a corporation. A corporation is not an alien ineligible to citizenship. A corporation is a legal person with no ancestry at all. The men who could not own an acre between them created an entity that could own all of it, and then they bought the entity. The land came from the Santa Fe Railway, through its agent Herbert Lapham, at 75 cents a square foot, on a block between Broadway and Hill Street. Suhu had been pointed at Lapham by Stanley Meigs, an assistant superintendent at the Union Terminal itself, which means the deal that produced the new Chinatown was brokered by a man working on the project that destroyed the old one. The money was raised entirely inside the community. 546.5 shares at $100 a share. $40,000 in hand by August of 1937. No bank loan, no outside partner, and a rule that nothing would be bought or built until the cash for it had been collected. They had watched what happened to people who depended on somebody else's balance sheet. 1938 is the year Los Angeles got 2 Chinatowns in 1 month, and the 18 days between them are the most exact measurement in this story of what the city thought it was replacing. The first one opened in the first week of June. It was called China City, and it was the work of Christine Sterling, who 8 years earlier had opened Olvera Street as a Mexican-themed marketplace on Easter Sunday of 1930, financed through a corporation organized by Harry Chandler of the Los Angeles Times. China City was a walled block where visitors were pulled through the streets in rickshaws by people from the community whose ground the block had replaced. Behind the rickshaws were about 50 shops and a temple. The buildings were not designed from Chinese architecture. They were assembled out of the standing sets from The Good Earth, the 1937 Hollywood film, including the set of the house of the film's main family. The architect was William Tunke, and the construction was supervised by a man from Paramount Studios. 10,000 people came on the opening night by the Times' count. Sterling made her public case for it in terms that are worth hearing exactly. Los Angeles, she said, is under obligation to the hundreds of Chinese who have been uprooted from where they have made their home for years, and the new China City will give these Chinese new opportunities. Decode that. The obligation she names is real, and she is the only person in this story who says it out loud in public. What she offers to discharge it with is a job in a themed attraction, in a replica of a village that never existed, built from the leftovers of a film about China made by white actors in makeup on a wage in a business she owned. Some of the merchants took it because it was the opportunity that was actually on offer in 1938. Sin Nan Ling moved his import business in and eventually ran 3 stores. Jake and Dorothy Sue ran a curio shop called the Flower Hut. Esther Lee Johnson worked evenings at a bakery there as a teenager. Choi Lan Fong worked in her father's basketry store, and years later described it in one sentence that holds both halves of the thing. "We lived in a fantasy," she said. "We all knew each other really well. The people there were like a family." 18 days later, on the 25th of June, 1938, the other one opened. The governor of California, Frank Merriam, and the mayor of Los Angeles both came to dedicate Central Plaza. 400 young people walked in the parade. Estimates of the crowd run from 25,000 to 100,000. And the corporation's own account is at the high end, so take it as somewhere in between and very large either way. 18 buildings had gone up, of 62 planned, in 3 groups along a new street the founders named Jinling Way. The architects were Earl Webster and Adrian Wilson, and what they produced was not a replica of anything. It was 1930s American commercial architecture with Chinese elements built into it, designed by the people who were going to trade out of it. They raised a gate of camphor wood said to be 150 years old, carrying 4 characters composed by the Chinese consul, T.K. Cheng, which translate as "cooperate to achieve." At the far end of the street, Y.C. Hong built a second gate in honor of his mother. In the middle, Professor Liu Hongke built a wishing well made to imitate the 7-Star Caverns, a rock formation in Guangdong province that a good many of the people standing around it had actually seen. The gate at the second end was not lit on the opening night. They saved it. It was switched on for the first time a year later, on the district's first anniversary in June of 1939, and 46 years after that, in 1985, the neighborhood held a second ceremony and relit it. This was the first Chinatown in the United States owned, planned, and operated by Chinese Americans. Not leased, not themed for them, owned. 2 districts 18 days apart on the same displaced population, offering the same city the same thing. One of them was a set, the other was a deed. That is the sentence people remember. It is not what the deed was actually worth, and the corporation's own books say what it was worth. 11 months after Central Plaza opened, on the 3rd of May 1939, Union Station opened on the ground both of them had come from. It cost about $11 million. It was designed by John and Donald Parkinson, the father and son who had designed Los Angeles City Hall, in a blend of Spanish colonial, Mission Revival, and Art Deco that people have been arguing about the name of ever since. The celebration ran 3 days and about 500,000 people came. It is, by common consent, the last of the great American railroad terminals. It is also worth saying plainly that the station was not an empty gesture. Within 3 years, it was running around the clock, with as many as 100 troop trains a day passing through it. The thing the city voted for, it got. 9 months earlier, on the 20th of February, 1939, fire had gone through China City and destroyed a large part of it. Sterling said publicly that she would not rebuild, and then rebuilt. On the 2nd of September, 1948, a second fire went through it. Neither fire was ever publicly resolved. That time, China City did not reopen. What was left of it was cleared in 1955. A few blocks away, the other district was putting its lights up. In early 1941, a 5-tier pagoda went up on Mei Ling Way, 50 feet tall and outlined in neon, and it glowed gold over the plaza for decades before it changed hands and became Hop Louie. The first Moon Festival, in 1939, had drawn about 25,000 people out behind a golden dragon 1,000 feet long. And in 1938, a couple named F.C. Chan and Y-Hing Chan opened a bakery in Central Plaza. His brother Loon joined them, and somewhere in the years that followed, they started making a fresh strawberry whipped cream cake, which is not a Chinese cake in any sense whatsoever, and which made a small Chinese bakery famous across the whole of Los Angeles. It is sponge under whipped cream, with fresh strawberries laid over the top and pressed round the sides, and it has been coming out of the same family's ovens ever since, which is longer than anything else in this story managed to stand. Phoenix Bakery moved to a purpose-built shop on North Broadway in 1977, and the third generation of the family runs it. Back at the start of the district, the corporation's own books tell its first 3 years in 3 numbers. About $100,000 invested by the grand opening in June of 1938, about $500,000 by the second anniversary in 1940, about $750,000 by the beginning of 1941, with roughly 20,000 people a week walking through it. Those are the developers' figures, and nobody audited them. But the direction of travel is not in doubt, because the buildings went up and are photographed going up. 18 units of a planned 62 in 3 years, financed $100 at a time by people who had been evicted 5 years earlier. In 1945, Peter Soo-hoo died. Reporting on his life gives his age as 45 and the cause as a cerebral hemorrhage. He had seen the district he assembled operate for 7 years. He was 45. The community he had incorporated was not finished inventing the things it was not allowed to have. The man who owned that bakery, F. Chow Chan, was refused a home loan because he was an immigrant. He did not appeal it. He spent the next 10 years organizing backers and applying for a bank charter. And in 1962, Cathay Bank opened in Chinatown, the first Chinese-American bank in Los Angeles. Look at the shape of that. In 1890, the community answered exclusion by turning a rented brick building into its own city hall. In 1937, it answered a land law by inventing a corporation. In 1962, it answered a mortgage refusal by chartering a bank. Every solution is the same solution, which is to build the institution that the country will not extend to you, and every one of them was necessary for exactly the same reason. The law caught up slowly and late. Exclusion was repealed in 1943, 61 years after it passed, with a quota of 105 Chinese immigrants a year. The California Supreme Court struck down the alien land laws in 1952, 39 years after they were written. National origin quotas ended in 1965. The city was not finished with the old ground either. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the freeway came through and took the last standing pieces of Old Chinatown west of Alameda Street, including the southern third of the Garnier Building, which was simply cut off the end and removed. 2/3 of it survived. Old Chinatown was not erased, it was buried, which is a different thing, and it came back up. The neighborhood the city voted over in 1926 is still lying under Union Station, 14 feet down, exactly where the fill left it. In 1987, a metro rail construction crew broke into it. Archaeologists worked the site on and off from 1988 to 1991, and what came out of that ground is now one of the largest collections of Chinese-American archaeological material in the country, held by the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. Figurines, jars and bowls, cooking vessels, jewelry, children's toys from a bachelor society that was not supposed to have children in it, ivory toothbrushes, and teapots, which is how the first crew knew what they had found. Everything dated between 1880 and 1933. Under all of it, older than the Spanish Plaza and older than the alley, the same ground had carried a Tongva village, and traces of that came up under the station too. Some of the recovered material was worked into a fountain in the station's own underground subway lobby, so people changed trains over it every day without being told. Union Station is still working, the largest railroad passenger terminal in the western United States. Central Plaza is still standing, under the gate with the 4 characters on it, in a Chinatown that the 2020 census counted at 7,798 residents, and that has spent the 2010s and the 2020s arguing about rent, as living neighborhoods do. Phoenix Bakery is still selling the strawberry cake, and 2/3 of the Garnier Building are still there, at 425 North Los Angeles Street. It holds the Chinese American Museum, open Tuesday to Sunday, 10 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, $3 suggested for an adult. Inside it, among the permanent exhibits, is a reconstruction of the general store that traded out of that building from 1891 to 1948. Outside the door, on the 400 block of North Los Angeles Street, which is the ground the old alley ran along, the city intends to build the first memorial to the people killed there in 1871. 18 sculptures, one for each known victim. The design was chosen from more than 170 entries. The city has said it aims to unveil the first site in 2026, and the remainder is aimed at the Olympic year of 2028. As of August of 2026, it had not been built. 155 years for a marker, 93 years underground, 2 points on a ballot nobody could vote in. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.